Welcome to This Week in Creationism, episode number 5, recorded October 1st, 2021. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we're going to look at the headlines from Creationism from the past week. A few of those are Shrinking Sun, Centipede Design, Trump Promotes Ark Encounter, White Squirrels, and Bird Nest Parasites. Just a few of the highlights from this past week in Creationism. Let's kick it off with the Shrinking Sun. Answers in Genesis ran this article for a day on the top of their website. The sun, is it shrinking? Their answer is no, it's not shrinking. And what they want to do is disabuse other creationists from continuing to use this outdated argument that because the sun is shrinking and has possibly shrunk in the past, that somehow discounts the idea that the sun could be billions of years old. No, in fact, we know that the sun isn't really shrinking and that it's powered by a nuclear power plant. And that's what keeps it from shrinking, as opposed to the old idea of gravitational collapse happening in the sun. And but that didn't stop some creationists from the 60s and 70s from using this shrinking sun argument to promote the idea of a young Earth. And Answers in Genesis is rightly saying that that's an outmoded argument. There's plenty of evidence that the sun has not been shrinking over time in any consistent fashion over billions of years. And therefore, that's an outmoded argument that shouldn't be used by creationists and specifically creationist speakers and apologists. They go on to point out that some creationists have moved on from the gravity argument about shrinking sun and have then started arguing that, well, you still haven't proven that the sun runs on nuclear energy because we haven't found neutrinos. They also point out that the neutrino problem has been solved, and therefore creationists shouldn't use the argument that neutrinos aren't being produced, and therefore we should be suspect of the standard paradigm of what operates the sun. And so they conclude that the traditional or the current mechanism for understanding how the sun operates and how it could have operated for hundreds of millions and billions of years is not actually impossible, right? In fact, it's likely. Now, of course, they end our article with, okay, the sun could be billions of years old, but it doesn't have to be billion years old. In fact, we know it's not billions of years old. It's actually only 6,000 years old. Nonetheless, so in other words, you have your evidence. And it doesn't really matter because it doesn't prove that it's old. It just says it can be old. So throw out that idea that the shrinking sun is a proof of a young Earth, but we're no worse off than we were before because we still believe that the Earth is young. The sun is young, and therefore the Earth is young as well. All right, moving on to Institutes for Creation Research. An article published there this week by Frank Sherman, one of the employees there, full-time employee at Answers in Genesis. Centipede adaptation is divinely engineered. So this is a rather typical argument. Take a particular organism, look at the special features that it has and how it's well adapted to its particular environment, and then conclude that because it's adapted to its environment, that's amazing engineering. Centipedes are amazing organisms that are adapted. So it's quite apparent that centipedes have a designed internal ability to speciate, rapidly change, over time in order to inhabit all these far-flung environments. Again, there's lots of different centipedes, but they're saying they're one kind or maybe 2 or 3 kinds of species that God created originally, but he created them with the ability to adapt, but in this engineered sense, and it's something that we've seen before. Remember, Institutes for Creation Research doesn't like to talk about natural selection as a method or a mechanism for adaptation. They prefer this continuous environmental tracking or a more engineering approach that says that really change is programmed into organisms and they're simply running and responding to the environment through these various programs that are built into them by God in the original creation. Actually, I think I've got a little more on that. Yeah, here we go. Here's the highlight. They have an internal ability known as continuous environmental tracking, CET. This amazing engineered capability did not evolve through chance and time, but was part of the genome, the total genetic information at the creation thousands of years ago. CET explains how organisms purposefully self-adjust to changes in environmental conditions. this is yet another article, one after another, that comes out almost every week that supports this this contention of Randy Gugliuzza, who's now the president of ICR, that organisms aren't responding to the environment through natural selection, which he considers a random process and without purpose, but rather that they internally respond through mechanisms that are, or programs that are already purposely there and put into the genetic information, again, in the original creation. So once again, we highlight a difference between Institute for Creation Research and the way that, say, Answers in Genesis would respond maybe to these same organisms. All right, now I turn to I was quite surprised by this week. Following Ken Ham on Twitter and Facebook, and he posted this both on the left-hand side, you see this tweet from Ken Ham, and then on the right-hand side, you see Ken Ham's Facebook post with lots of comments and lots of likes and lots of shares. And what he did was he posted a video of Donald Trump promoting an event that's going to occur at the Ark Encounter. And it's about a 2-minute video in which he explains how this is going to be a huge event and how it's almost going to be better than the 2024 election. And this ark that's been built there is one of the biggest wonders of the world, along with the wall on the southern border and so forth. And so it's a rather funny skit, and it does say at the bottom that it's a fake President Trump. This is a deep fake President Trump made by Ben Price, who's an impersonator. And so it turns out that Ken Ham hired Ben Price, wrote a script for him to read in Donald Trump's voice to have it look like Donald Trump is promoting this event at the Ark Encounter. I was, for myself, I was rather kind of, I guess, not surprised by this. But also surprised. I mean, it clearly is, getting very close to, taking a political position. And Ken Ham has never just outright come out and say that all of his followers should vote for President Trump, and has been directly supportive, but has certainly supported people in and around Trump's sphere. But what it does tell me is, and it should tell you, is he knows his audience, right? He knows his followers, because it can be a very dangerous thing to use a particular politician, a very polarizing politician, to send a message, right? And but he doesn't seem to be fearful that using Trump's image and likeness is going to distract or bother his audience. And in fact, if you were to read I'm not going to show you any of them, but if you read these comments, these 59 comments, oh, it's glowing. It's like, how wonderful this is. And someone were actually fooled by the video, thinking that Trump actually had done this, because I think they could conceive of Trump actually supporting the Ark Encounter and doing something for them. But most of them were, they got the gist of it, and they knew it was an impersonation, but they thought it was absolutely wonderful, and of course had lots of glowing comments about Trump and his future. And so there's no big backlash at all against using Trump for an advertising policy. But, I would ask, if he then, went out and used a Biden impersonator to have the same message, what would be the response to that? He's playing to a specific audience and not afraid to play to that particular audience that he knows is his following and his base. And so in my mind, this is one of the closest endorsements, I guess you could say, of Trump and his policies coming from Ken Ham. And this is really coming from Answers in Genesis, even though it's only Ken Ham that posted this. So far, I haven't seen this show up on the Answers in Genesis website. I was intrigued by how this was done. And so I did a little searching, and I found out that if you go to this website, Deep Trump, Ben Price will make you a video for, your birthday party or any event you want, or you just want to send it to a friend for $258, right? You write the script and he will voice it over, and then they have a computer that then will match it up with his face in front of the White House. I honestly, as an aside, it bothers me that we're using his likeness in front of the White House image to say a variety of things, but it kind of fits the whole, fake news, fake stuff that some might say emanate from, from Trump from time to time. I'll just put it that way. I do think that Ken Ham, not Ken Ham, but Answers in Genesis, because I'm sure Ken Ham didn't pay for this personally, probably paid the weird number of $407.50 to have this video made so that he could share it on various social media. So that's where your donor dollars are going, right? Somebody donated money to Answers in Genesis that then ended up paying for this Deep Trump video production. All right, let's move on from there because I really don't want to talk about politics on this particular channel. Creation Ministries International, I'll say CMI, they have been pushing very hard a series of videos, and this is actually a screenshot from their YouTube channel, but on their website also they've been pushing this their live news program, Creation Live. And they have a very professional set, and they actually just published this 1 hour preview or overview of how they do it, like how they do their live program. And it's been actually going for a little while, and it hasn't grabbed a lot of attention, but I think they've been sort of figuring it out, and so they haven't been promoting it very widely. But now I think they're ready to launch in and really push it harder and try to get a bigger viewership. It sounds like maybe Thursdays they're going to have sort of these new videos or live shows going on. Now, that's interesting because Answers in Genesis has a Facebook live news program, Answers News, that comes on Mondays and Thursdays. And they've been doing that for quite a while. And they record those, and you can find them on YouTube, and it's a quick way to generate a lot of material. And so now we have CMI sort of jumping in there and sort of the live news game, and I assume that eventually they might have some feedback forums and other things coming as well. So that's what CMI is up to. In terms of the other content that they have published this week, here's an article on brood parasitism. And brood parasitism is I've thought about many times writing an entire article on my blog about brood parasitism. It's really fascinating stuff, but it raises some very challenging questions about how to explain the origins of brood parasitism and how it works. So let me explain really briefly what it is. There are several hundred different species of birds that I'll say that they cheat the system. They, so for example, cowbirds here in North America, they will lay their eggs in another bird's nest, and then that other bird either is tricked and doesn't realize that it's raising a bird that isn't its own offspring, so it keeps it in the nest, and they sit on it and incubate it, and then feed the chick when it hatches. A more maybe sophisticated way or complicated way of being a brood parasite is that some brood parasites will not only lay their eggs in the host nest, but they will then watch the parent birds. And if the parent looks like that they're suspicious of the egg and tries to remove it, those birds will then come in and attack that nest and then throw all the other eggs out, forcing that bird then to lay a bunch more eggs, which uses and costs a lot of energy. So they will warn the host bird. All right, they'll warn the bird they're parasitizing that they'll do that. All right. And the other birds have learned that. And so they will just put up with having the wrong egg in their nest, and they'll raise that young chick, that cowbird, despite the fact they may even know that it's not their own young, simply because they want to raise their young as well. But then it gets even more pernicious than that. There are other brood parasites bird parasites that lay their eggs in the host nest. And then when those eggs hatch, some of them have special adaptations or characteristics, we'll call them, that allow those little baby fledgling birds in the nest to push out the other birds in the nest. and then and then essentially be the only birds left, and then have these parents, surrogate parents, feed them and raise them, even though they're not actually their genetic offspring. And this article actually mentions this. It goes through all these different scenarios, and some of them sound really horrific, right? I mean, there are some brood parasites that have hatchlings that have little claws on their wings. And after they're hatched, they'll use those claws to rip apart the other young in the nest that aren't the brood parasite young, and then throw the parts out of the nest so that only they will be raised. Right? This is pretty vicious stuff. And so, of course, this article is going to raise the question, well, how did that come about? Like, how did that happen? How did you get to that point? There is a really deep literature in evolutionary biology about all the different scenarios and like how natural selection operates and could function to create these different patterns of behavior in birds, what the advantages and disadvantages of these things are. And this paper doesn't really, delve into that at all. They're really raising the question, how could such what apparent evil, could arise? How could there be such organisms doing this? And, so they spend 95% of the paper describing this. And at the end, their solution is, we know that all these birds were very good in the original creation, and they wouldn't have used other nests, in other birds to raise their young. They would have raised them themselves, and they were very good, and they didn't harm anything else. And so somehow sin must have corrupted them, and they have, they've become aggressive against other birds. That's not, I guess that's an explanation, but it's an explanation without any kind of cause or any mechanism. And it's not terribly satisfying. I'm sure that many people might read an article like this and be actually almost amazed by the complexity and the intricacy of the design of a brood parasite, and how amazingly adapted they are to do what they do in order to survive, and wonder, well, how did they become so adapted? We just looked at ICR and continuous environmental tracking, and you would have to say there, if they're right, that God programmed into these birds the claws and the behavioral patterns of baby birds pushing out other birds and killing them on purpose. Those things had to have been encoded in the genome somehow as programs in the original creation, the original good creation, in order to create this behavior later on. I just don't know how that's a satisfying explanation to one who holds that particular interpretation of what the original created organisms had to have been like, and added on to that no new information or nothing could have evolved or changed after that creation. It all had to be contained in that original creation somehow, even prior to Adam's sin. So, brood parasitism is I'll just say it's just fascinating. I hope that someday I have a chance to maybe go into a little more detail on this and say maybe pull out some of the interesting theological questions that result from them. But let's move on to white squirrels. All right, another article from Creation Ministries International the next day. This is I think a pastor somewhere, not really not a biologist, but he was fascinated by white squirrels on the campus of his where he works. And the question is, how could there be white squirrels? But more so, it's really just there are white organisms, and white is not an advantage, and it's a mutation. Melanism, the lack of ability to produce pigment, and usually that's a bad thing. Although this author even pointed out there are situations where that's good. For example, there are organisms that live in the high Arctic where it's white all the time, and that mutation actually ends up being a benefit to organisms, either because it allows them to hide from predators or allows them to sneak up on prey. Either way, it's a beneficial allele, when that change occurs. But at the end, this is just another one of thousands of articles where we look at an organism, we say, look, there's been some changes. Some of those changes are good, some are bad. Depends on the environment. They employ natural selection quite a bit in this particular article, and appeal to natural selection and how this is these changes are sculpted by natural selection for whatever environment they're in. So a la contrary to Institute for Creation Research, which would say it was something that was already known, programmed, and maybe a response to the environment, but not because of natural selection. That's hard to explain, but there are real differences between these two views. Well, at the bottom line, when they get down to the bottom of the article, it's sort of the main message ends up being, well, these changes can happen and organisms do adapt to their environment using these, what can actually be mutations. So new information, but it's never really brand new in their minds. And therefore, and besides, these squirrels are still squirrels, even if they have these changes. So therefore, this isn't evolution, right? It's the same old natural selection happens, but natural selection isn't evolution. And therefore, there is no evidence here for evolution, even if evolutionary biologists might actually use this as an example of allele change over time in a classroom. That would be inappropriate in their minds because this isn't actually evolution at all. Okay. Sticking with Creation Ministries International, you might remember if you've watched a previous episode that they published an article, The Dread of Man, Part 1. And the question was, where did animals come up with the fear of man? And what the author there is saying is that there is this in Genesis 9:2, talks about animals having fear of man, and this author is proposing that that is a supernatural change that God caused in organisms for their own protection after the flood, because after the flood, man was allowed to eat meat, and therefore they should be afraid of man if they were going to survive. And I think this author doesn't see how that could happen naturally, like that fear could have evolved. And therefore, since it couldn't have evolved, God must have just installed it into these individuals at that point in time. I find this interesting because many creationists are averse to employing supernatural special creation after the first 6 days of creation originally. And then therefore, they usually try to find naturalistic explanations, like the whole flood. Usually there's naturalistic explanations put forward for how the flood was caused, and all the things that it resulted in are usually broached in a scientific sense. But here he's just going straight for the supernatural explanation. There's a whole bunch of stuff in this article, but I just want to highlight one thing. And that was the thing that struck me was how I'm always hit by how these articles go about raising a bunch of questions, which I hadn't even thought about, which makes this issue even more complex and less believable than when they first started. All right. And it was they're trying to come up with a solution, and then come up with 5 more questions and really no solutions. I was like, you'd be better off just not to write this article. And here's an example. He's talking about vitamin B12 and how that's something that you get from eggs and meat and dairy products and so forth. And he's saying, that would have been difficult for man before the flood to have gotten these nutrients. And he actually has other examples too of dietary problems with not eating meat. And so after the flood, eating meat was a good thing in a way. And here's the quote over here. God's lifting of the ban on meat eating ensured that people could ingest sufficient protein and obtain essential nutrients, ensuring a balanced diet and healthy bodies. Now, when I read a quote like that, I think to myself, so God had to lift the ban on meat eating in order to make sure that we had enough protein and other minerals and nutrients in order to be healthy. I kind of wonder, why didn't God just make us, if we weren't allowed to eat meat to begin with, right? If that's the correct interpretation, that man didn't eat meat from the beginning, didn't God create man good and be able to sustain himself on what he created him, like in the garden, like what was available to him, presumably the fruit trees and vegetables and so forth? Wasn't that sufficient for his diet? So you're suggesting that after the fall, somehow man's internal physiology and how we actually digest food and what we need to survive changed. And then we were deficient for a while. And then so God's like, okay, now you can eat meat because you need this meat. It seems like a solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed to begin with, right? That God shouldn't have put man in a position of being deficient anyway. I mean, we should be marveling at our body's ability to get the nutrients we need without this thing that we're told we can't have. I don't know. I don't know if you see where I'm aiming at here, but I just find that he's trying to create a solution, like I said, a reason why God would let man eat meat after the fall, and trying to find a reason for that in a natural problem that he thinks man would have beforehand. But he's finding that natural problem in our understanding of human physiology today, and then sort of like, pushing that back in the past, extrapolating toward the past. I don't know. Not worth talking much more about this. If you really want to, try to figure out what he's saying, then go read this article on creation.com. It's right there on the front page. So that's it for this first part of creation, this week in creationism. There's actually a whole bunch more, so I'm going to make a number 6, which will actually cover the same week because there's been so many different highlights from this week. In fact, I'll give you a little preview of that. So episode number 6, we're going to look at Ken Ham saying no to space rocks destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. And we're also going to ask the question, what's in a name? Specifically, what should young earth creationists be called? I just call them young earth creationists, but not all of them want to be called just young earth creationists. They have other names for themselves. And I'm going to go over what Todd Wood says about this because he asks that question on his blog. He asks, what am I? And he goes down very convenient over all the names that young earth creationists have been called by themselves, not pejorative names given to them by other folks, but what creationists have called themselves and what they think they should call themselves. We'll take a look at some of those because I think they give a nice, helpful history of young earth creationism. So we'll be back with that later. Great to talk to you, and if you found this informative, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.